Now I'd like to call your attention to Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, the 20th through the 25th verse. It has already been read, and hopefully you paid attention to that. And in Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter, in addition to that scripture, and the 5th chapter, in the 24th verse, we have a scripture that says, "And ye said, Behold, the Lord our God hath showed us his glory and his greatness." I'd like to speak to you today from those two scriptures on the subject, the glory of the story. The glory of the story. The glory is in the story, or the glory of the story. And it's interesting that I decided to preach on this last night at 10 o'clock, and I come to church this morning, and the scripture reading is on the material that I decided last night to preach about. So maybe there's something to that. Maybe the glory is in the story. In this scripture that we have today, Moses is telling the children of Israel about the glory of their past, the things that have happened to them, the things that they have done, the things that others have done to them, and the things that God has done for them. Oh, it's a beautiful conversation when you can look at the things that others have done to you, and then look at what God has done for you, and count it all a blessing. And that's what Moses is saying to these folk. When you get into this new place, when you get into a place where you don't have to get up early in the morning and work till late in the evening or afternoon, when you don't have to start fires with wood, you can just push buttons. When all of those great things happen to you, don't forget the story that is a part of your reality that tells the journey from where you are to where you're going, because there is some glory in the story. You know, this month, this church has done a wonderful job in putting together services that are in celebration of Black History Month, and Linda has done such a great job in giving us material before the sermon that's sermonic in its own nature. This is a great time for us to remember, and it would be fine, it would be wonderful if we could get every child in the country, white and black, to understand the story of Black History Month, of Black History period, of American history, and what the contributions that black people have made to the history of this country. Oh, it would be a wonderful thing if that story was told boldly, and articulated fairly, that it is not just black history, it is not just a story of black people, it is a story of Americans. How a country rose from the degradation of slavery to full participation of those who had been slaves into the life of the country. Oh, it is a wonderful story. So here Moses tells these people not to forget the story, to remember the story and tell it to the children. So I want to emphasize to you today the importance of this story and telling it to your children, because for too many, We have not told the story, and there are people who are ashamed of the story. I remember when I was a child, there was this movie called Imitation of Life. And this movie featured a young woman who had a white father and a black mother. And she goes through her youth trying to deny her black mother, trying to deny any connection with her blackness. And we all as kids went to that movie that featured Mahalia Jackson singing, "Soon I'll be done with the troubles of the world," and we all cried. Well, they did. I was tough. They cried. And the idea of someone being ashamed, and I think that the reason we cried so was because in the South there's just such devotion to motherhood, to your mother, and for somebody to be ashamed of their mother, to denounce their mother, was just incomprehensible to us. But the fact that someone would be ashamed of his or her race is a shameful thing. You see, your race might do some shameful things because they are in a system that requires shameful things, but that is no reason to be ashamed of them. That's a reason to be ashamed of the system. So we should never be ashamed of our story. And we should never wait until some month, Black History Month, to tell our story. We should not even call it, and I don't even know whether it makes sense anymore to have a Black History Month. I think that we ought to insist that every day, every month, that all of our children, black and white, be reminded of the greatness of this nation and the great contributions that every group has made to this country. Now, we ought to tell this story, and one of the reasons we ought to tell it is because the story gives meaning to the moment. The story gives meaning to the moment. You see, you have really deprived your children. We are depriving young folk in this country, black and white, of the meaning of the moment, because they don't know the story that led to the moment. And it is embarrassing sometimes when you don't know the story that has led to the moment, because you can't have full emphasis. You cannot have a full impact of the meaning of the moment. I remember when I first came to this area, I taught at a predominantly white school. And when I started teaching at the school, there were very few black children. And I could teach all day, 5 classes, and only come across about 4 or 5 black children. And I remember in one of these classes, there was this particular kid, he's black, and he just clowned around. And there I was, a man who had gone through all kinds of things in the South, who had stood in front of a tank on Lynch Street in Jackson, Mississippi, and with guns all aimed at me, and had seen people do all kinds of things. And there I was, a teacher in a classroom, and this black child in the classroom with all these white children just clowning. And I said something to him one day. I can say some things in the classroom. You know, I'm real nice in the pulpit. But I can say some things to kids sometimes to get their attention. And I said something to him that got his attention. And he went on and told his mother that I was trying to embarrass him in front of the white children. Now, what I told him, maybe I'll tell you what I told him. What I told him was, I said, do you know what a minstrel show is? And he said, no. I said, well, a minstrel show is that when white folks painted their faces blacks and clowned and entertained people, because they were doing things that they thought that white folks were too dignified to do, but it was okay for blacks to do them. I said, now, as long as you are willing to come to the school and clown for these white children, they won't have to go to a minstrel show because they have you. Well, he went home and told his mother. His mother, he went home and told his mother. Now, the kids eventually learn, never go home and lie on me to your parents, because I will out-talk you when they come. So his mother came to school. She called me that weekend. She came to school that Monday to see this Mr. Jenkins. I took him to the office when we talked, and I told her of the story. I told her of how I had worked with people in the South, risked my life to gain the opportunity for that kid to be in that classroom. And when she finished talking to me, she said to him, if I wasn't at this school and wasn't pregnant, she was going to have a child in a few weeks, she said, I'd take my shoe off and beat your butt right here. We have not told children the story. When you let kids run around and do all of this work, all of this sweat, all of this tears, all of the life that have gone into the opportunities, and you let your kids run around talking about making C's in school. They're doing all right, they're making C's. What do you think those folk who gave their lives for that opportunity would think? And you're going around bragging about children making C's. You who don't know the meaning of the moment unless you know something about the story. And we need to tell folk about the story. Even you here at this church, as some of you think about the future of the church. Yes, it might be an option to let it close, to let it die, to give it away, to sell it. But there is a story. What about those people from all over the district who came on Saturday and gave their time and built this building, laid drywall and labored at night and prayed and gave their last full measure to this moment? There is some meaning in this moment. And the only way you can find the meaning of the moment is that you have to know the story. You have to know the path that led to this place. And if you don't tell the story, the children will not know. And Moses knew this, and he told us, so don't get down there and become comfortable and not tell the story. Because the story gives meaning to the moment. The story also gives power to the people. The story gives power to the people. You see, people are sometimes powerless, weak, and bowed down because they do not know their story. They don't know what people like them have done. They don't know what people like them have done. And because they don't know what people like them have done, they don't know what they can do. You see, in the South, they used to have a covenant. And covenant was a church meeting that they had, and the preacher was not even there on Covenant Sunday. And the folks would go to the church and give their covenant or their determination. And everybody there had a song, and they would start with their song. And then after they sang their song, they would stand there in the midst of the congregation and tell their determination. They would tell what they had been through. They would tell what they were going through, but they would tell where they were headed. where they were going. And they would tell such powerful determinations, destinations, hopes, and fears until the people who heard them said, I think I can press on. I remember one time I was chopping cotton. Yes, in Mississippi. I was chopping cotton. Don't feel sorry for me. I'm doing fine now. But I remember one day I got angry. And the man said something to me and I left. Said, I'm not putting up with this anymore. And I left, started walking away. And an old black woman followed me and said, son, where are you going? I said, I'm going to walk back to town. She said, well, why don't you stay till the evening to get your pay? I said, I can't put up with this man one more moment. And she said, look at me. She said, I put up with a whole lot more than you have. You ought to be able to put up with hell for a day. You ought to be able to put up with hell for a day. Now I stayed until what we call knocking off time. I stayed. But I've been through some things since then that were difficult. And I always tell myself, you ought to be able to put up with hell for a day. You see, when you know what other folks have gone through, when you know what people have gone through, I couldn't imagine children. I used to tell this to students. I can't imagine children sending parents, sometimes single parents, mothers. I couldn't imagine sending my mother or watching my mother go to work in the morning, working at a job that paid minimum wages or a little bit more. I couldn't imagine my mother going off to work and then sending me to school. And I spend my time at the school goofing off and playing. I couldn't imagine seeing what they have done. I can't imagine seeing what other folk have done to get me to this point, and I not do anything. The story ought to give you inspiration. I remember going to hear Fannie Lou Hamer speak at Tougaloo College. I had seen her in high school, and I went back to see her at Tougaloo College. This was a woman who was actually a sharecropper. She had beaten and had been beaten and chased off of her sharecrop. But now she was making speeches trying to get other people to be inspired. And I went to see Fannie Lou Hamer, and she talked to us as college students. Everybody in the audience practically were college students, Jackson State or Tougaloo College. And at the end of her speech, she said to me, now don't you all tell me about how difficult life is for you. And she quoted Langston Hughes. It said, well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor and bare. But all the time I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps because you find it's kind of hard. Don't you fall now. For I still going, honey. I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. So when young people start talking about how difficult things are, it should tell them the story and say, you don't know what difficult is. All times are so hard. You haven't seen hard times. You haven't seen hard times. Oh, it's difficult for me. You haven't seen hard times. I've seen black people go and stand in line for hours for boxes of powdered milk and what we used to call commodity cheese. and go home and feed their children and send them to school day in and day out, and they made A's. You haven't seen hard times. If you knew what hard times really were, you would get up and really work. There is power in their story. And we have reared powerless children because we have not told them the story, and we have not used the power of the story to move them to higher heights. I'm always conscious of what other people have gone through to do what I do. When I was in the classroom teaching with all that technology and all the stuff that I could do so easily, I could get angry with my kid and say, I'm going to give you all a test, and have a test read in 15 minutes. And I remember those teachers had to type up stuff, and they put it on something called a stencil, and they put it on this blue stuff, and they run in, the ink was all over their hands. I remember all of that. And when I see what they went through and how easy they have made life for us, there should be nothing too difficult for us to do. The few things that we have to do. Even when it comes to going to church. I saw what people did to go to church. What black people, and you know, I watch folks in their church time. I watch people in their religious lives. Which brings me to the last part of this sermon. You see, the story gives credit to God. The story gives credit to God. You see, when Moses told the people this, he said to them, you are to remind your children of the role that God has played in your deliverance. That it has not been because of you. It is not because you're smart. It's not because you're well organized. It is not because you're politically savvy. It is because of God that you have come this far by faith. That's what has brought you. Don't think it's your education. That's great. Don't think it is your smartness. That's great. Don't think it is your organization. All of that's great. But Moses wanted them to know that it has been the hand of God that has been over you and watching over. His eyes have been watching over you, and his arms have been caressing you, and that's what has brought you this far. Oh, it would be dangerous. It would be dangerous if you leave that part of the story out in your telling it to your children. Oh, it would be very, very tragic if you would leave that part of the story out in your telling it to your children. Because that's the part of the story that's been the most powerful element of the whole story. And that has been something that has been consistent with black people. Their devotion to God. Their belief that God was in the midst of their movement. Their belief that God was watching over them. Their belief that it was the Lord. That I shall lift up mine eyes toward the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help coming from the Lord. You know, people sometimes tell me, say, you know, I'm surprised about you. What are you surprised about? I'm surprised that all of the changes life has gone through, you're still pretty much the same. I'm surprised that now you lecture at colleges and universities, and colleges use your books as texts, and you're still William Jenkins. You're still the same. I'm surprised at all of that recognition you could have. You don't seem to be excited about that. You're still basically the same. I said, well, you don't seem to be caught up in the change. I said, well, I am caught up in the change. But not the change you're caught up in. Here's the change I'm caught up in. I'm caught up in the change that I experienced one Wednesday afternoon under a pecan tree in Mississippi, when I prayed to God to change me, to change my heart, to change my soul, to change my life. That's the change. And that change was so thorough. That change was so complete. That change was so powerful that I don't have to get excited about any of the changes. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Jesus all the day long. I know the story. And I know the place that God, or the part that God played in the story. And that's my job, to tell that part that God has played in the story. I will tell the story. I know what God can do through it all. Through it all. I saw my mother with a 25-pound sack of flour feed all of us all the week, and it never ran out. I know what Jesus can do in the story. Now, some people say, well, you know, you're so intelligent now, you ought to experiment with Eastern religions. You ought to experiment with some of the more popular, classy religious philosophy. You ought to do some of that. I'm not interested in anything. I might sound unlike a person with 3 degrees. I might sound unlike an individual who has written 10 books. But I just want everybody to know that I got Jesus. And that's enough. Oh, we